It's a cold 30th of November 2023, and I'm reading out of Return to Elysium. It's a life of Joan Grant. She is Lucina, and she had been brought up in Greece. Then she goes to Rome, she marries Nigellus, and then she leaves Nigellus. We're now in the third part of this book, and it is chapter 4, The Fire. The voyage was calm, but the food must have been stale, for I broke out in boils. The one between my eyebrows was much more painful than those on my neck. I did not ask for sympathy, because Euripides tried to pretend they were not due to eating hard bread which had gone mouldy. One of the sailors, a man with a scar on his hand, washed them for me, and they healed before we came in sight of the coast of Greece. The shipmaster said he would put us ashore at the landing steps of Elysium instead of taking us to Athens. I stood in the prow of the ship, straining my eyes in an effort to see the house. Gulls screamed over the ship, and the vivid sea was flecked with spume. I felt Euripides put his hand, strong, reassuring, under my elbow. "Frightened, Lucina?" "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not frightened, only a little anxious. Until now I have never dared to think that Elysium may be deserted. Or worse, it may have been bought by a stranger who will send us away. Elysium could never be bought. Asclepius would have given it to someone who could never forbid entry to any of us who really belonged." "But do we belong? You do, but I ran away. And now you're coming home. We're both coming home." He said it so loudly that I realized he was also afraid. "We must not be afraid," I said. "When I first came here, I was frightened. I thought Elisa left me because she had never really loved me. But I found I was welcome. You were also kind." "Remember how you felt then," he said urgently. "Come back to Elysium believing in goodness. See through the eyes of a child who has kept faith in kindliness." "I feel like a child, so it should be easy. Do you think there are still red sea anemones in the rock pools and violets growing close to the water's edge? I will make a wreath for you if there are still violets." Hand in hand we ran across the empty landing stage. Along the path under the pine trees, down the natural steps of dear familiar boulders to the first cove. I suppose we must have said goodbye to the sailors, but I forgot the ship until I saw her, far out towards the horizon, sails curved to the west wind. The rock pool was deep and clear. I took off my patched tunic and slid into the warm, kindly water. I scrubbed my body with white sand. It was good to feel clean again, to lie naked in the sun, to feel my hair clean and salt and alive, spread out behind my head on a smooth rock to dry in the vital air. There were violets of night blue and white, growing in the shelter of their scented leaves under the pines, far more than I remembered. Now my hands were so clean. I was aware of a greater subtlety of texture in their narrow stalks as I threaded them together. And my fingers must have become wiser, for I never broke a flower. Before, when I made wreaths, I spoiled many of the flowers, but now I had not picked a single one too many. Euripides had wandered off somewhere, but I finished the second wreath. I saw him coming back through the pines. He carried 2 white tunics in his hand. "I found them in the pavilion," he said. "Either we were expected, or else their presence was a convenient coincidence. It would have been unsuitable to put on our old clothes. I think they should be burned." I looked at the clothes we had discarded and realized how horrible they were, stained with mud and torn. They must have shrunk when I tried to wash them on the ship, for they were surely much too small. "Why must we burn them?" I said. "Wouldn't it be easier to throw them into the sea?" Asclepius preferred discarded garments to be burned. Perhaps it was only a courtesy to give them the freedom of fire, and perhaps it was not Asclepius who instructed us in this matter. The pyre is an older tradition, not without significance. I smiled. Even in so small a matter as the discarding of outworn tunics, Euripides never lost his sense of the dramatic. We will build a funeral pyre, I said, driftwood with streaming banners of flame against the blue backcloth of the sea. We shall act as pallbearers to the symbols of our dead selves, and you must compose a suitable oration. Surely, with all our faults, we have not been so inconspicuous during our sojourn among foreigners that we deserve to have our remains committed to ashes without due ceremony. While I considered what lines would be appropriate, he said, you can collect firewood and be sure it is dry. It might be awkward if the fire went out. Finding dry wood was more difficult than I expected. The trees were lively with sap and had no dead branches. Even the cones and pine needles must have been swept up by some over-careful gardener. Usually there was driftwood along the beach, but today there was only an unbroken line of quiet surf. Suddenly I thought of the cave where we had stored the wood, which might have been needed for a different pyre. Long ago, when we believed the cloaks of Tyrian purple had brought death into Elysium. Was it still there? Surely we must have used it, or had everyone else forgotten it too? As I ran along the beach, I saw that the house on the headland was no longer deserted. The shutters had been repainted, a pale, clear yellow, and the garden was gay with flowers. A young woman was coming down the path from the stream, carrying a water jar on her shoulder. I waved to her, but she did not see me. A man came out of the house, and they stood laughing together in the sunlight. He looked a year or two older than she did, perhaps about 25. He wore a short beard and his hair curling to the shoulder. It was the colour of pine bark, brown with a glint of copper. From the way they looked at each other, it was easy to say they were happy, just being alive together. I was glad the house was being lived in by the right kind of people, people who would never be afraid because a shutter banged forlornly in the wind, who would sit by the hearth, content to watch the fire of their own wood bring heat to the food they had grown, to the fish they had caught. I wondered who they were. Both of them seemed vaguely familiar, and so did the little boy who was playing with a puppy further along the beach. I intended to speak to him, but the puppy ran up the steps towards the pine tree, and he ran after it. I could hear him laughing as I went past. The cave was dark, and for a moment I was afraid to go in. I had not been here since the terrible day when I had brought my share of the wood here and cried in secret because I was afraid the others would know I was afraid. But I had made myself go back, made myself collect my share of the fire we had built on the beach against the darkness. The night we drank too much, and I had to be carried back to the house because my legs were disobedient. How funny I must have looked, or were the others too drunk to notice? They could not have been so drunk as I was, or they would not have been able to carry me. The wood was surprisingly light, I suppose because it was tinder-dry driftwood, part of one oar, the leg of a stool. It had been inlaid with silver like the one Iris used when she acted as my scribe. A child's toy, a shutter that once had been painted blue. The wood was splintered close to the hinge as though it had been forced open or weakened by swinging loose in the wind. I built the pyre close to the sea. When the tide came up, the sand would be washed clean of ashes. Give the ashes back to the sea. Fire and water in their marriage is freedom. Who had said that? I could not remember, but it seemed important. It does not matter who said something that is true. Truth is stronger than words or the men who use them. When the pyre was ready, I saw Euripides coming down the path carrying a lighted torch. He looked solemn, and yet he was smiling. I put all our clothes on the pyre, the tunics, the sandals, the hair ribbon I had worn on the boat. Hadn't I a cloak, the cloak Iris gave me? I remembered I had given it to the shipmaster as a present. It was the only thing of value I could give him. I had forgotten it was wearing a gold bracelet. Should I put that on the fire too? Yes, said Euripides, the fire will clean it. Gold loves being washed in fire. But won't it melt? Nigellus gave it to me when Marius was born. I suppose I was so used to wearing it that I forgot it was still on my arm. I didn't bring any of the other jewels with me, only this bracelet he bought in the village. Oh, I hope he has found someone to make him happy, dear Nigellus. Lucina, do something for me and don't ask questions before I light the fire. Yes, of course. What shall I do? Think hard. So hard that you feel as though you were there, of the statue you and Nigellus put in the garden when you first went to the villa, the statue of Apollo. Imagine yourself asking Apollo, the part of him which you carved into the stone, to let Nigellus find a woman who will do much more than make him happy, who will give him the freedom to make himself happy. To give him the freedom to make himself happy. Stop. Don't try to do it unless you are sure you could let him find real happiness with another woman. Are you sure you don't want to go back to him? Are you sure? I hesitated, but only for a moment. Yes, I said slowly. I thought I should always be jealous of another woman, meaning more to my husband than I did. But I don't feel that anymore. I would be grateful to her, just as I'm grateful to Flavia for making Marius happy. Have I stopped being jealous only because I have realized that he was never really my husband? No, I must be more than that, for I was a very ordinary mother to Marius. Shall I start thinking of the statue now? You have said your prayer. His voice was gentle. Apollo heard. But I haven't done anything yet. Didn't Porcius tell you that you never noticed the real miracles because they seemed so easy? Don't think about it any more. Put your hand on mine so that we set light to the pyre. I watched the flames taking up the thin, worn clothes. They turned into colors as they burned, scarlet and green, blue and yellow. Is it the sword in the wood? I said. Yes, it is the sword. I expected him to make a long oration, but he only went close to the fire and said, we ask to endure by the power of the sword from which the dead wood finds the color of the morning. Such small ordinary words, but they made me want to cry without sorrow, to laugh without bitterness, to dance without the shyness of immaturity or the precision of age. A wave broke over the cooling ashes. Euripides bent down to pick up the gold bracelet from the white sand. It was wet with seawater, salt water as he put it on my right arm. The fire did not blur the writing on it. Before I gave it back to you, I made sure you could always read to Lucina in love. Chapter 5 is entitled The Gold.